The most commercially successful of all the Godzilla films, King Kong vs. Godzilla is the third entry in the series, and it marks the first time either monster was seen in color. It was produced as part of Toho's 30th anniversary celebration, and like the previous films before it, was heavily edited before releasing in America. New scenes with American actors were added, but the most interesting change was the use of music from the classic Universal monster films, no doubt due to Universal Studios being a distributor of the films in the U.S. The plot revolves around a chairman of a pharmaceutical company who discovers a type of berry growing on Faro Island. He wants to sell the berries as they're a cure-all, however the natives on the island fear letting them go lest they suffer the wrath of the island's monster god. The chairman figures that there's no better way to market the product than with a giant monster, so he sends a team who ultimately get the berries and capture the natives' worshipped god, King Kong. Meanwhile, two American pilots discover Godzilla emerging from an iceberg, and he immediately makes his way towards Japan. When King Kong escapes his captors, he too finds his way to Japan, and thus the showdown begins as he and Godzilla battle it out for supremacy. It's a pretty standard B-movie fare, with my only criticism being that it takes two-thirds of the movie for Godzilla and King Kong to even meet. In films like this where the plot is secondary, that's too long. However, it isn't all bad since the entire film is only like an hour and a half. The lack of an Akira Ifukube score in the American version is bothersome, but I have to say that the Universal music is pretty cool to hear. Another thing I noticed is how outdated this film is. I don't mean in terms of quality, but rather a few sequences that occur that show this movie's age as you'd never see them today. This also lends a hand toward the unintentional humor of this film. Granted, it's campy in its own right, but as a whole, the film is far too ridiculous to take seriously. But, really, why would you? The effects are okay. The costumes for both King Kong and Godzilla look pretty bad, and the miniature sets look poor compared to what they'd become in just a few short years. However, I still do enjoy them from a so bad it's good mindset. Overall, I find King Kong vs. Godzilla's impact to the franchise and film as a whole greater than its actual merit. It's a movie that really showed Toho that they could even make a real franchise with Godzilla, and it's become a notable piece of pop culture. And, no matter what criticism I give this movie, it's still a fun watch. And how couldn't it be? It's King Kong versus Godzilla, for Christ's sake. If you get the opportunity, check it out. You're in for a good time. Now, before I end this, there are a few things I'm pretty much obligated to talk about. It's just some neat trivia about the movie that I found interesting. A few years after this film, Toho made another movie featuring King Kong, entitled King Kong Escapes. In that movie, Kong battles Mechani-Kong, a giant robot doppelganger. This idea would be essentially reused 7 years later with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. King Kong Escapes was not a sequel to King Kong vs. Godzilla though, and it marks the last time Kong would appear in a Toho film. For decades, a myth circulated this movie about there being a dual ending. It was said that in the American version of the film, King Kong won, but in the Japanese version, Godzilla won. This dual-ending myth has been recorded in books and other media for a long time, but the truth has since been brought to light. The dual-ending myth is exactly that, a myth. There are some slight differences in the film's endings, but they're minor and the outcome remains the same. In 1992, as a part of their 60th anniversary, Toho decided that it would be a good idea to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla. Unfortunately, the idea fell through as it was determined that it would be too difficult to obtain the rights to King Kong. Instead, Toho decided to use Mechani-Kong, but once again would have faced troubles for using a likeness of the giant gorilla. What eventually came to be was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Now, I have nothing against remakes per se when they're done well, but largely I don't find them necessary. But, to steal words from James Rolfe, this begs for a remake. Of all the Godzilla movies I'd like to see, an updated version of King Kong vs. Godzilla is on the top of that list, especially with the advancements in technology in the last 50 plus years. I'd love to see the two go head to head on the big screen, with Legendary Pictures heading the Godzilla franchise in America and now also working on a new King Kong movie. It may only be a matter of time before we see that happen again, and that would be pretty awesome.